Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever found something in the dark, something that shouldn't be there, but you can't quite explain what it is? The question lingered in my mind as I stood there, staring at the yellow papers before me. They were scattered across the dusty desk, ancient texts that hadn't seen the light of day in over a century. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the mention of a ritual, one that had been performed in this very place long ago. The mention was brief, cryptic, and buried deep within the archives. But it was enough to stir something in me. A curiosity. A dread. I had always been drawn to the unknown ever since I was a child. My fascination with history, with forgotten places, with the things that lived in the shadows, was both a blessing and a curse. It was what brought me here, to this decaying library, to these walls that seemed to breathe with secrets. The room smelled of mildew, its wooden shelves sagging under the weight of time. The air was thick with dust, each inhalation scratching at the back of my throat. But it was something else that gnawed at me. Something beyond the stale air. A sensation that prickled the hairs on the back of my neck. It was the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the room was empty, save for the shadows cast by the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. The silence was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Yet, there was something wrong with it. The silence was too still, too deliberate. I returned my focus to the papers. The symbols on the pages were unsettling, an intricate web of lines and curves, ancient runes that seemed to pulse with energy, as if they were alive. My fingers hovered over the page, drawn to the patterns, even though I could feel the chill creeping into my bones. It was then that I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible noise. A whisper. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But then it grew louder, clearer, as if the very walls were speaking. The words were indecipherable, a language I had never heard before, but the tone, it sent a shiver down my spine. It was as though they were beckoning me, urging me to uncover whatever lay hidden within the ritual. I tried to shake the thought from my head. It was just the wind, the building settling. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong here. Something had happened in this place. And the deeper I went, the more I could feel it reaching out to me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the room until they drowned out everything else. My heart raced as I clutched the edge of the desk, trying to steady my breath. Then, the air shifted. The room, once familiar, now felt foreign. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening. The smell of mildew was replaced with something darker, heavier. It was a metallic scent, thick and nauseating, like blood. I could taste it in the back of my throat, bitter and coppery. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, just on the edge of my vision. It was gone the moment I turned my head. I knew then that I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched didn't leave. It lingered, like a cold hand resting just at the edge of my consciousness, always there but never fully present. My heart drummed in my chest, too fast, too loud. I fought the urge to look over my shoulder again, to reassure myself that the shadows were just that, shadows. But they weren't. They couldn't be. I returned to the desk, my fingers trembling slightly as I turned the pages, desperate for some explanation, for something that would make sense of what was happening. The symbols on the old paper seemed to twist in the dim light, changing just enough to make me question my sanity. They looked like they were shifting, curling into new shapes, almost as if they were alive. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus. The last thing I needed was to lose myself to my imagination. I had to find answers. The ritual. The symbols. They were connected, somehow. I wasn't sure how, but I could feel it. The whispers were louder now, as though they were speaking directly into my mind, a language I couldn't understand, but could feel. Like a distant echo, something ancient and forgotten, clawing its way to the surface. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath, but the whispering was relentless. It was all around me, pressing in from every corner, like the walls themselves were closing in. And then, there was the smell again. The same metallic scent. It was stronger this time, suffocating, almost as though it had seeped into the very fabric of the room. I opened my eyes, my stomach turning. The shadows had deepened. They weren't just shadows anymore, they were shapes. Figures. They moved ever so slightly, just beyond my sight, like something was skirting the edges of the light, just out of reach. The floorboards creaked. 1, 2, 3. Footsteps. No one was supposed to be here. My pulse quickened as I slowly turned my head, half expecting to find a person standing just behind me, but there was nothing. Just the empty space. The oppressive silence. But it wasn't silent. Not anymore. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, almost forming words. My name. I froze. No, it couldn't be. I glanced at the papers again, the ritual still fresh in my mind. The text was now moving too, its ancient letters shifting before my eyes. I could almost make out a phrase, "The sacrifice will awaken." My breath caught in my throat. Sacrifice? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I leaned closer to the pages, feeling drawn to them. I had to understand. I had to know what it meant. A sudden chill washed over me, colder than before. The room seemed to stretch, warping around me. The walls, once sturdy, were now bending, the edges curling in on themselves. The light from the small lamp flickered, casting grotesque shadows that writhed along the walls. A low sound filled the room, like a hum that vibrated in my chest. It grew louder, clearer, until it was deafening, a high-pitched, shrill noise that seemed to be coming from within the walls themselves. I stumbled back from the desk, my heart pounding. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. The shadows were closer now, more solid. I could almost make out faces, twisted, contorted, their eyes wide and unblinking, staring at me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. I tried to breathe, but the air had become thick, heavy. It pressed down on me, suffocating me. My chest felt tight, as if the very weight of the room was crushing me. A sudden movement caught my eye. A figure, just in the corner of the room, dark and indistinct, but unmistakable. It was watching me. Waiting. And in that moment, I knew it wasn't just a shadow. It was something more. The room seemed to stretch further, the shadows warping into figures that no longer seemed like tricks of the light. They had substance now. They were something more than just silhouettes. I could feel their eyes on me, cold, unblinking, their gaze slicing through the very air. The buzzing hum that had filled the room was gone now, replaced by the sound of something else, something wet. The sound of dripping. I didn't dare turn my head to look, but I could feel it creeping behind me. It wasn't just in the corner of the room anymore. It was everywhere. It was all around me. I glanced toward the door, but it was no longer where it had been. The room had changed. The space felt bigger, as though the walls had pushed outward. Or maybe I had shrunk, the world around me closing in. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that the room itself had taken on a life of its own, like the walls were breathing, alive with something ancient, something malevolent. The air was thick with that metallic scent, now overpowering, nearly choking me. My stomach turned. I turned my focus back to the desk, the papers. I had to understand this, had to know what was happening to me. The ritual. The symbols. I ran my fingers across the text, the paper crinkling under my touch. It was strange, but for a moment it almost felt like the symbols were pulling me in, like they were calling me, urging me to complete something. My breath quickened as I read the words again, the same ones that had stood out before. The sacrifice will awaken. The weight of the words pressed against my chest, suffocating me. I had seen the symbols, I had seen their power, but what was this sacrifice? And why did it feel like it was calling to me? Suddenly, the whispers returned. Louder this time, more insistent. They weren't just in my mind anymore. They were in the room, circling me, filling the space. It was as though the walls were chanting, the very air vibrating with ancient power. The sound of their voices was deafening, growing louder, clearer. But the more I strained to hear, the less I understood. The words were alien, their meaning just beyond reach. I snapped my head around, my eyes searching the shadows, my body frozen in place. Something moved in the dark. The figure was closer now, its shape more defined. I could see the outline of its form, tall, thin, impossibly long limbs that seemed to stretch and distort as it moved. Its face was a blur of shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, staring into me, as if it could see through to the very core of my soul. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair behind me. My breath was ragged, my chest tight, and yet I couldn't tear my gaze away from the figure. It moved closer, slow and deliberate, as though it was savoring the fear that radiated from me. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed. The air shifted again. The metallic scent was overwhelming now, thick, suffocating, like blood and iron had seeped into the very walls. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deep, guttural sound, like something was breathing in the darkness. It was heavy, wet, and labored. I couldn't breathe. My chest ached, my vision blurred, but through it all, I could still see it. The figure was just in front of me now, and though I couldn't see its face clearly, I knew it was smiling. The edges of its form were shifting, as if it were flickering in and out of existence, never fully present but always there, just on the edge of my perception. It reached out. My body jolted, the sudden movement breaking the paralysis that had gripped me. I staggered backward, knocking over a stack of papers as I tried to run, my mind screaming for escape. The door was just a few feet away, but it felt like miles. I could hear the creaking of the floorboards beneath its weight as it followed, a slow, deliberate step echoing in the now silent room. I reached the door, my hands trembling as I gripped the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. I pulled harder, panicking, but the door refused to open. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I turned around. The figure was there, just inches from me now, and in that moment, I knew it wasn't just watching. It wasn't just waiting. It was waiting for something. The floor beneath me creaked again, and I realized too late that the shadows were closing in. The walls seemed to shrink, the darkness swallowing up the space around me. My heart pounded, my breath shallow, and my legs shook beneath me. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that had taken over the room. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure's face. It was almost human. Almost. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to lose all meaning as I lay there, sprawled across the cold, wooden floor. When I finally opened my eyes, the room was different. It was darker, the shadows deeper, the air thicker. I could still smell it, the metallic stench, pungent and overwhelming, seeping into my skin, filling my lungs. It was as if the very space had become soaked in it, like blood soaked into fabric, unremovable, permanent. I rose to my feet with difficulty, my head spinning, my vision swimming. My body felt heavy, weighted down by something I couldn't name. My hands shook as I reached out to steady myself against the desk, but it wasn't just the tremors of fear. It was something else, something inside me was changing. The room was eerily still, but I could feel it in the air. The presence, the thing that had been stalking me, was still here. I couldn't see it, not yet, but I knew it was just waiting, lingering, always just out of reach, watching from the shadows. It was like the air itself was alive, pulsing with an unseen energy. Every breath I took felt like a struggle, as if the very act of inhaling was fighting against something dark, something ancient. I staggered toward the window, desperate for some form of escape, but as my fingers brushed the edge of the sill, I realized the world outside was not the same. The streets, the familiar landmarks, everything was different. The sky was a sickly shade of gray, the clouds swirling in unnatural patterns. It was like a storm was brewing, but there was no sound, no wind. The silence was overwhelming. My throat tightened, panic creeping up my spine as I backed away from the window. There was no escape. I couldn't escape this place. I couldn't escape what was inside it, what was inside me now. The ritual was unfolding, and I was a part of it. Sacrifice, awakening. The words echoed in my mind, a relentless chant that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. The symbols, the ritual, it was all connected. But I still didn't understand. Why was I here? What had I awoken? A cold breeze swept through the room, though the window was shut tight. The air around me seemed to ripple, distorting the space as though the world itself was warping. The shadows twisted and shifted, moving of their own accord. The sound returned, that wet, unnatural noise, like something breathing, like something waiting. I turned, my heart racing, my body frozen in terror. It was there again, just at the edge of my sight. A figure, taller than any human, impossibly long limbs stretching unnaturally. The air around it seemed to bend, warping like heat on a summer's day. I could barely make out its face, but I didn't need to see it clearly to know it was something far worse than anything I could have imagined. Its eyes, they were endless. Black, like pits, like deep holes in the fabric of the universe itself. There was no end to them, no light, no humanity. It was moving toward me, slow and deliberate, each step more sure than the last. I backed away, my legs trembling, but I couldn't move fast enough. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, pushing me toward the thing that was waiting. The whispers returned, louder this time. It was no longer just a hum in the background, It was a symphony of voices, a cacophony of ancient sounds that twisted through my mind. Words began to form, words I didn't want to hear. You are the chosen. The words hit me like a physical blow, a shockwave that reverberated through my skull. I fell to my knees, my hands clutching at my head as if I could push the voices away, but it was no use. They were inside me now. They were a part of me, woven into the very fibers of my being. The ritual must be completed. I looked up, the figure looming over me, its presence suffocating. Its face, if you could even call it that, was shifting. It wasn't human, not in any way that I could recognize. It was a collection of nightmare shapes, a face that seemed to blur, distort, and flicker between forms too horrible to comprehend. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, my voice lost in the sea of whispers that surrounded me. You are the key. The words were clear now. The ritual. It wasn't just something that had happened in the past, it was happening now. And I was part of it. A sudden, violent pain shot through my chest, a searing heat that spread through my limbs, making my body jerk in agony. I gasped, unable to breathe, as if the very air was suffocating me. The figure was reaching for me, its hands, long, elongated fingers, outstretched, inches from my skin. I could feel the coldness of its touch even before it made contact, the frozen, unnatural energy crawling through my flesh. But then, a break. A flash of clarity. I pushed myself backward, scrambling, trying to get away from the thing that was consuming me, but I could feel it closing in. There was no way out. I was trapped. Trapped in the ritual. Trapped in the darkness. The room was alive now, a pulsating mass of shadows and whispers. My body was no longer mine, something else was inside, controlling me, pulling me toward the center of it all. Toward the ritual. Toward the sacrifice. And I knew then that there was no escaping it. No escaping what had awakened. I was suffocating. The air, thick and stifling, felt like it was closing in on me. It was as though the walls were pressing in, the ceiling lowering, the ground shifting beneath me. I could no longer tell where I ended and the room began. I could feel the ritual, the dark energy pulsing through every crack, every crevice, every corner of this place. The figure before me was growing larger, more solid, more real. Its shape twisted and contorted in ways that should have been impossible, its eyes, those endless black pits, staring into me, devouring every shred of my sanity. You are the vessel. The voice was in my mind again, not a whisper, but a thunderous roar that reverberated through my skull. It was no longer just speaking, it was commanding. I could feel my body trembling, my hands slick with cold sweat, but there was no escape. The room had become a grotesque mockery of reality. The floor was no longer solid, each step I took seemed to sink, as if the ground itself was made of liquid and ever-shifting mass. Shadows flickered, their movements erratic and unnatural. I turned in every direction, but the room was always the same. The same suffocating, twisted place. I had seen this before. The symbols. The words. The ritual. It was all connected. I was part of it. The sacrifice, the awakening, it was all meant for me. I had been drawn here, pulled in by forces I didn't understand. Forces that I now realized were far beyond my control. I could feel my mind slipping, the edges of reality blurring. The pain in my chest was unbearable, a fire burning from the inside out. My breath came in ragged gasps, the pressure building, suffocating me. But in that agony, I felt something else. A shift. a realization. The ritual was close to its completion. You will serve. The figure's hand was inches from my face now, its long fingers reaching for me. I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in its gaze, in the darkness. I could feel it, its presence, pressing against me, filling my lungs, choking my every thought. But then something else broke through. A spark of resistance. I wasn't just part of this ritual. I could fight. I had to. I gathered every ounce of strength I had left, the desperation rising within me like a tidal wave. My body screamed for release, for freedom, but the fear, so deep, so raw, held me captive. The figure's hand was so close now, I could feel its coldness. Its fingers grazed my skin, sending a wave of ice through my veins. No, I couldn't let it. With all the force I could muster, I shoved against it. The figure's hand jerked back, and for a split second, I saw something within it, something hidden behind the blackness of its eyes. Fear. It was afraid. And in that instant, I understood. It wasn't invincible. It was vulnerable. I turned toward the desk, my legs trembling, barely able to stand. My vision was swimming, but I had to find it. The symbol. The key. The thing that would end this, that would stop the ritual from consuming me completely. The papers were scattered across the desk, the strange markings still etched in dark ink. I didn't understand them, but I didn't need to. I had to end this. I had to break it. My hand reached out, shaking violently as I picked up the first piece of paper I saw. The symbols burned against my skin, the heat searing through my fingertips. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The figure was coming closer again, its presence suffocating, its coldness like a weight on my chest. It was no longer just a figure, it was an entity, a force of darkness that stretched across the very fabric of this place, pulling everything into itself. But I could feel it. The ritual was unraveling. The symbols on the page began to blur, shifting, moving under my touch. The room trembled, the walls cracking, the floor groaning beneath me. The air was charged with electricity, crackling with raw energy. I didn't know what I was doing. I couldn't explain it. But I had to finish it. I pressed the paper against the ground, the ink of the symbols pooling into the cracks in the floor. The room howled, a deafening screech that rattled my bones, and the shadows recoiled, twisting violently as if they were being torn apart. The figure shrieked, a sound so inhuman, so wretched, that it felt like my very soul was being torn from my body. The darkness around me began to fade, but not completely. There was still a lingering presence, a weight in the air, something that wasn't quite gone, but not fully there either. The figure, it had retreated, but it was still watching. Waiting. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, my mind reeling. The pain was gone, but there was something else, something more terrifying. The ritual had been stopped, but at what cost? I stood, my body weak, my legs unsteady, but I knew it wasn't over. The room was still alive, still pulsing with that dark energy. I didn't understand everything that had happened. I didn't know what the ritual had been or why I had been chosen. But as I looked around, the symbols fading into the walls, the figure's eyes still burning into the back of my mind, I knew one thing for certain. The ritual hadn't been stopped. It had only been delayed. And whatever had been awakened was still out there, waiting. It was an old legend. the kind that gets lost in the pages of forgotten books, buried beneath layers of time and dust. But sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it wakes up, and when it does, it seeks what it lost. I found it on a rainy evening while I was going through some old archives, hoping to distract myself from the endless thoughts that had been haunting me. The legend was scribbled in the margins of an old manuscript, barely legible but unmistakably chilling. It spoke of a curse, a forgotten plague that had ravaged a village centuries ago. But what caught my attention was not the curse itself, it was the date. It was recent. Too recent to be a coincidence. As I read further, I felt an odd pull, an inexplicable desire to know more. But with each sentence, the weight of something heavy, something wrong, pressed down on my chest. I didn't understand it then, but I was about to. I needed to find out more. I had to. My name is Daniel, and I suppose I'm not much different from anyone else. I've had my share of loss, my share of scars, but like most, I've learned to move forward, to keep the past where it belongs. But after discovering that curse, everything changed. What began as a curious dive into history turned into an obsession, a need to understand what I had stumbled upon. I spent days, then weeks, combing through any and every scrap of information I could find. The legend mentioned a small village, its name long erased from maps, and a strange force that had come to call it home. The details were vague, but there was one unmistakable element, the curse. It wasn't a sickness, or a disease, or even a simple spell. It was something older, something more primal. As I dug deeper, I began to notice things. Little things. A book out of place. A faint smell in the air that wasn't there before. It started with a creak, barely audible, coming from behind me when I worked late into the night. At first, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. But then it became more frequent. More insistent. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't tell anyone about it. Who would believe me? A scholar obsessed with an old curse, talking about creaks in the night like some paranoid fool. But it wasn't just sounds. There were whispers. Barely noticeable at first, like a distant murmur, like something being said just out of reach. At night, I would sit at my desk, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I could hear the whispers clearer now, though they weren't words. No, not quite. More like a presence, lingering just behind me, breathing down my neck. And then the dreams started. I'm not sure when they began, but I remember them clearly. A village, surrounded by trees. The air was thick with fog, and the people, if you could call them people, moved slowly, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted in eternal agony. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. And then I saw it. A figure, cloaked in shadow, standing in the center of it all. Its eyes were pits of blackness, and when it turned to look at me, I could feel it, something ancient, something deep and hungry, stirring inside me. It reached out, and I woke up in a cold sweat. The dreams became more vivid, more intense, each one leaving me feeling more drained than the last. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. The line between the dreams and reality started to blur, and I found myself slipping deeper into something I couldn't explain. Something I didn't want to understand. One evening, as I sat at my desk, scanning in another old manuscript, I felt it again, the creeping sensation, like something was just behind me. I turned around, heart racing, but there was nothing. Nothing but the faint scent of something burning. A sudden thump sounded from upstairs. My stomach dropped. I knew I wasn't alone. I climbed the stairs carefully, trying to control my breathing, my mind racing. Each step creaked underfoot, a constant reminder of the silence that had fallen over the house. My hand gripped the railing, and as I reached the top, I saw it. The door to the attic was ajar. It had been locked for years. I didn't know what made me go in. Curiosity? Fear? A sick sense of inevitability? Whatever it was, I couldn't stop myself. The attic was cold. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and dust. I stepped forward, every movement amplified by the silence, my heart pounding in my chest. And there, in the corner, on the floor, was a book. One I had never seen before. The pages were old, yellowed with age, and the cover was marked with symbols that I recognized from the curse. The pages inside were filled with a language I couldn't understand, but the images, they were unmistakable. The same village from my dreams, the same figure standing in the center, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. And then, on the last page, there it was. The symbol. The mark of the curse. The one I had seen in every dream, in every vision. I reached out to touch it, but the moment my fingers brushed the page, a cold wind rushed through the attic, slamming the door shut behind me. The whispers started again. Louder this time. Closer. You've awoken it. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just shadows. That was the moment I understood. I hadn't been reading about a curse. I had been becoming part of it. And now, there was no escape. The whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder as the wind rattled against the windows, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out the words. They were like a distant song, melodic, but ominous, a constant reminder that something was wrong. I stood frozen in the attic, staring at the book in my hands. It felt heavier now, as though something inside it was pushing back against my touch. I wanted to throw it away, burn it, forget it ever existed, but something inside me, the same curiosity that had driven me to open the manuscript in the first place, refused to let go. You've awoken it. The words echoed in my mind. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were in my thoughts, repeating over and over again, as if they had been etched into my very soul. I slammed the book shut, my fingers shaking, and backed away from the corner. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the old house, and for the first time, I noticed something different. The air was thick. Not in the usual, musty way, but in a way that made every breath feel heavy. Like the house itself was breathing with me. I turned and bolted down the stairs, the creak of each step louder than before, and when I reached the living room, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of nausea. The room, my sanctuary, felt wrong. The walls seemed to press in on me, the shadows darker than they should have been, stretching unnaturally along the floor like fingers reaching out for me. I tried to shake it off. It was just my mind, playing tricks. But the air felt like it was closing in. Then, the doorbell rang. A loud, persistent sound that seemed to cut through the tension, but when I turned toward the door, I knew I wasn't expecting anyone. My house was isolated, on the edge of the town, and I hadn't had a visitor in weeks. I swallowed, my heart racing as I moved toward the door. It was odd, unnerving, but I had to see who it was. When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was the cold. It was a sharp, biting cold that felt unnatural. The temperature in the room had dropped so suddenly that my breath fogged in the air. Standing on the doorstep was no one. Nothing but the wind. My pulse quickened, and I stepped outside, looking around. The street was empty, the houses around me cloaked in darkness. There was nothing here, nothing that would explain the sudden chill in the air. But as I turned to close the door, something caught my eye. A small symbol was carved into the wooden frame, barely visible but unmistakably familiar. The same symbol I had seen in the book. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, my vision blurring as I stepped back inside. My mind raced. There was no way this could be happening. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But deep down, I knew. I had already crossed a line. The curse had followed me. It wasn't just a myth anymore, it was alive, and it was looking for me. The house felt colder now. The shadows were deeper, stretching longer, their edges sharp like teeth, and the whispers, oh God, the whispers, were no longer just in my head. They were coming from the walls, from the floor, from the very air around me. I slammed the door shut, and for a moment, I thought I heard something breathing on the other side. But there was no one there. I ran back upstairs, heart pounding, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere that seemed to cling to me. But the moment I stepped into my bedroom, the floorboards creaked beneath my weight. I froze. I wasn't alone. Someone was standing in the corner of the room, their back turned to me, staring out the window. I couldn't see their face, just the dark outline of their body, swaying slightly, as though they were waiting for me to make the first move. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, my chest tight. My body refused to move. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, growing louder with each passing second, like a countdown, an inevitable approach of something terrible. And then it turned. The figure's face, if you could call it a face, was not human. It was a blur of darkness, a shape shifting in and out of focus, like a nightmare made flesh. Its eyes were hollow, endless pits that seemed to pull at my very soul, and its mouth was wide, too wide, stretching impossibly across its face in a grin that was more a snarl than anything resembling a smile. I staggered backward, my breath coming in short gasps, and I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The air was thick with fear, suffocating, choking the words before they could escape. The figure took a step toward me, and I heard it, its voice. Not words, not anything that made sense, but a sound, a low, guttural hum that vibrated through my bones. You've awoken it. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the shadows moving closer, like they were alive, like they were part of this thing. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My legs were frozen in place, my mind screaming for me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure reached out with one long, twisted arm. Its fingers, pale, almost translucent, began to stretch toward me, and as they came closer, I could feel the cold, the biting, soul-deep cold, radiating from its touch. It's too late, the figure whispered, though its lips never moved. I closed my eyes, bracing for whatever would come next, and just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door to the room slammed open. I gasped, turning toward the sound, and the figure, it was gone. But I wasn't alone. There was someone standing in the doorway now. A man, tall and thin, with deep-set eyes and a face that was strangely familiar. And in his hand, he held a small book. I didn't move. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. The man in the doorway stood perfectly still, his eyes locked onto mine with a strange intensity. The world around me felt muffled, as though I were underwater, hearing only faint echoes of what was happening. I wanted to speak, to demand who he was, but the words stuck in my throat. My body was still frozen, like I was caught in the grip of something beyond my control. The stranger stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, his feet making no sound on the creaky floor. He was tall, maybe taller than anyone I'd ever seen, and his features were sharp, too sharp. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his dark eyes seemed too deep, as though they could swallow you whole. His hair, dark and long, fell across his face in uneven strands. He looked like something from a forgotten dream, disturbing, yet strangely familiar. "Who are you?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze drifted to the book in my hand. He didn't even need to ask. I could feel the weight of it, the silent accusation in the air. He knew. He knew about the book. "I was wondering when you would find it," the man said softly, his voice low and smooth, like velvet. It should have been reassuring, but it only made my skin crawl. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My mind was too full of questions, each one more frantic than the last. How did he know about the book? What was happening? Was I losing my mind? "Don't worry," the man continued, as if reading my thoughts. "You're not mad. At least, not yet." His words hung in the air like a sentence I wasn't prepared to hear. But before I could respond, he stepped closer, so close that I could smell the faint scent of something stale, like old leather mixed with earth and decay. It was the kind of smell that made you want to step back, to run, but I couldn't. My feet felt nailed to the floor. He reached out, and I flinched instinctively, but his hand stopped just in front of my face, hovering like it was waiting for permission. "I need you to listen to me carefully," he said. "You've awakened something that's been sleeping for centuries. This," he gestured vaguely at the room, "the book, everything around us, is only the beginning. The curse is real, and it won't let you go until it has what it wants." I tried to speak, to ask more questions, but all that came out was a strangled gasp. His words, though unsettling, felt strangely true. My mind raced to make sense of them, but the reality of the situation, the dark figure, the whispers, the cold, made everything seem surreal. The man leaned in, his breath cold against my skin. I could feel his presence pressing against me, like a weight. "You're not alone in this. It's already inside you. Watching, waiting. But there are ways to stop it. You have to understand that. You have to know what you're dealing with." I took a step back, my hands trembling, the book still gripped in my fingers. "What do you mean inside me?" My voice was barely more than a whisper, but I was desperate now. "What's inside me? What's happening?" The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at me, his eyes narrowing. His face twisted into something like a frown, though the expression was fleeting, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. "It's not the book that matters," he finally said, his voice quieter now, almost urgent. "It's the bloodline. You're connected to it, connected to the curse." I felt my heart skip a beat. My blood ran cold, and for the briefest of moments, I felt as if the room itself was closing in on me. "Bloodline?" I repeated, trying to make sense of it. "What are you talking about?" The man stepped back, lowering his hand. He sighed heavily, as though he had expected this. "I'm sorry you had to learn this way, but there's no other way now. Your ancestor, he was the one who made the pact. The one who started the curse. You carry his blood, and that means the curse has claimed you as its own. That's why you're hearing it. That's why it's calling to you. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. An ancestor? A pact? Was I really the victim of some ancient curse? It all sounded insane, but there was something in the man's eyes, something almost too real, that made my stomach twist. He took a deep breath, his eyes flicking toward the window, as if sensing something. The curse doesn't just wait, it grows. The more you try to escape it, the more it tightens its grip. But there are ways to fight it, to weaken it. I swallowed hard. Ow! The man's eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker behind his cold stare. Something human. Something desperate. You have to finish what was started, he said. You have to complete the ritual. I blinked. The words felt like they had been pulled from some twisted nightmare. What ritual? What are you talking about? His face was stone now, unreadable. The same ritual that brought the curse in the first place. The air seemed to thicken again, and the shadows around the room stretched, undulating like a living thing. The temperature had dropped even further, and the strange feeling of something being in the room with us was suffocating. Listen to me, the man whispered urgently. You need to make a choice. Do you want to stop this? Do you want to survive? Because there's no other way. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me, and for a moment the room seemed to spin. I was trapped, and the air seemed to thicken further. It felt like the walls were closing in. I looked down at the book, the one that had started it all. The one that had brought me to this moment. The whispers were louder now, creeping into my mind, and the darkness around me was moving, shifting. Something was coming, and there was no escape. The man's eyes never left mine, his presence now suffocating. Every word he spoke seemed to thrum with a hidden urgency, as if the very air around us was charged with the weight of what was about to unfold. You need to understand, he said again, his voice sharper now, more insistent. The ritual was never meant to be forgotten. It was bound to the land, to the bloodline. Your ancestor, the one who first made the pact, he was a fool. But that doesn't matter anymore. What matters now is you. I felt my stomach churn, the weight of his words sinking in like lead. I tried to speak, to ask him more about this ritual, but no words came. My throat was tight, as if the air itself had thickened, making it impossible to breathe normally. The ritual, I forced out, the words scraping my dry throat. What is it? What does it want? He stepped forward, his shadow stretching unnaturally long on the floor. I wanted to move, to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, like I was caught in some kind of trance, my body obeying the terrifying pull of his gaze. The ritual was a pact, he said slowly, one that binds a soul to the land. A curse was placed in exchange for power, and now, every generation born of that bloodline is bound to the curse. Every century, the curse awakens, seeking its next victim. My head spun, and I took a shaky step back. The room felt smaller, the walls closer, as though they were closing in on me. I tried to focus on the man, to grasp what he was saying, but his words seemed to blur in my mind. But why me? I whispered. Why now? The man's lips curled into a faint, almost sad smile. Because it's time. The curse can't just linger forever. It feeds on fear, on the suffering of those it marks. And you, he paused, his gaze flicking to the book in my hands, you are the one who opened it. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, colder, pressing down on me as if the very house were breathing in sync with the terror that filled the space. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the corners of the room. A presence, ancient and hungry, moved just beyond the edge of my vision. The man stepped back, and for a brief moment, the room returned to silence. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It was thick, suffocating. The only sound was the soft whisper of the wind outside and the quiet rustling of the leaves against the windows. "You have two choices now," he said, his voice now distant and hollow. "You can fight, or you can submit." I didn't understand. Fight? Fight what? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze towards the small wooden table in the center of the room. The dim light flickered as he walked, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. He motioned for me to follow. Reluctantly, I did. He stopped at the table and picked up a small, tarnished object. It was an amulet, shaped like a twisted knot of branches, its surface engraved with strange symbols that I couldn't recognize. I reached out, instinctively drawn to it, but he pulled it back just out of my reach. "This," he said quietly, "is the key. The ritual requires it." I stared at the amulet, my mind racing with questions. What was this ritual? What did it want with me? The cold dread in my chest tightened, and I realized, with horror, that the man wasn't talking about a simple chant or a book. This was real. The curse was alive, breathing, and I was part of it now. He continued, "The ritual requires blood, a willing participant, and an offering. But the bloodline, it always demands more. A sacrifice." I recoiled, my stomach churning at the word. "Sacrifice?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "Yes," the man said, his eyes darkening. "The curse doesn't just take, it consumes. And if you're not careful, it will claim you. It will claim your soul." The amulet was in his hand again, and he turned it over slowly. "You'll need this to start the ritual. Without it, there is no way to undo what's been done." I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. I hadn't wanted to be part of this. I hadn't asked for any of this. Yet, here I was, caught in the web of an ancient curse, with no idea how to escape. "You're lying," I whispered, the words trembling on my lips. "This can't be real." He fixed me with a stare that cut through me like ice. "I'm not lying. And you know it." My mind was spinning, my thoughts a blur of confusion and fear. The room around me seemed to distort, the shadows growing darker, the air colder. My vision blurred, and I felt the presence I'd sensed earlier grow stronger, closer. The whispers were back, low and guttural, filling my ears. They seemed to come from all around me, from the walls, the floor, even the very air I breathed. I could almost hear words, half-formed, like they were speaking in a language I could almost understand. But then, something changed. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, crawling along the walls like something alive, reaching for me. I stumbled back, but the shadows seemed to follow me, closing in. "No!" I gasped, panic rising in my throat. "No, no!" But it was too late. The floor beneath me began to tremble, and the lights flickered violently. I could feel the temperature drop even further, until it felt like I was suffocating in ice. The man, the stranger, was no longer standing before me. He was gone, vanished into the darkness, leaving me alone with the suffocating presence that now filled the room. The whispers grew louder, their voices more distinct, but still not fully comprehensible. I could feel it. The curse. It had already claimed me. The shadows seemed to breathe. They wrapped around the room like tendrils, shifting and stretching, forming shapes I could barely comprehend. The whispers, low, guttural, and filled with malice, swirled around me like a storm, growing louder by the second. I could feel them against my skin, like 1,000 cold fingers grazing my body, dragging my senses into a place where the very fabric of reality seemed to bend. I stumbled backward, my eyes wild, trying to escape the encroaching darkness. The air was thick, suffocating, and the cold that pressed against me felt more like a presence than a temperature. I could no longer tell where the walls ended and the shadows began. They moved, and I knew, instinctively, that they were alive. But I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, rooted to the floor by an invisible force. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one colder than the last, my chest tight with panic. The amulet, still clutched in my hand, burned against my skin, its twisted metal biting into my palm. It was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality, but I wasn't sure for how much longer. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. Everything went silent. The oppressive cold was gone, leaving an eerie stillness in its place. I felt a moment of fragile relief. Maybe it was over, but that was the illusion. That was when it came. A figure materialized in front of me, emerging from the darkness like something born of nightmare. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could recognize. It was wrong. Its form flickered, unstable, like a shadow that didn't know what it wanted to be, but it had a face. I couldn't make out the details at first. Its features shifted constantly, as though it had no true shape. But I felt its gaze. It wasn't a gaze that sought understanding or connection. It was a gaze that wanted to consume. Its eyes were wide, black as night, and within them I could see flashes of movement. Like something else was inside them, something alive, something ancient. The presence was suffocating. My heart hammered in my chest, but I couldn't look away. I felt its pull, its gravity, dragging me toward it. It was hunger. That was the only way I could describe it. Pure, unadulterated hunger. It didn't speak at first. It didn't need to. Its very being was a communication in itself, an overwhelming sense of need. I could feel it in my bones. It was the curse. The thing that had been waiting for me. I forced myself to take a step back, but my feet were stuck in place, as though the very air had hardened around them, keeping me bound to the floor. I wanted to scream, to run, but all that came out was a strangled gasp. Do you understand now? The voice came from nowhere, but it was clear, cutting through the silence like a knife. It wasn't the figure that spoke, it was the air itself. The room itself. The curse. You are the one it chose. Your bloodline, it's a tether. A thread. A doorway. And now, you must complete where your ancestor began. I couldn't breathe. My mind was spinning, disbelieving, but there was no denying it. The air was thick with the presence of this thing, and my body could feel its power, its age, pressing in on me. There was no escape from it now. The amulet in my hand grew hotter, the metal pulsing with an energy I couldn't understand. I felt it calling me, urging me to do something, anything. But I didn't know what to do. The figure's face twisted again, its features distorting like a broken mirror. For a moment, it resembled something human, something that might have been once, long ago, but that too faded quickly, leaving behind the hideous, ever-shifting shape. Complete it, it said again, its voice growing louder now, more insistent. Complete the ritual. The curse demands it. It felt like the ground beneath me was trembling, and I heard the faintest sound, the scraping of metal against stone, coming from somewhere in the darkness. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. Something was moving, something was coming closer. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, half hidden in shadow, was an old wooden chest. It had appeared there as if from nowhere, its surface scarred and worn. I didn't know how it had gotten there, or why, but I knew it held what I needed, or what the curse demanded. I took a step toward it, my legs shaking beneath me. The figure, the thing that was no longer a man, no longer anything, didn't move. It just watched, its empty eyes filled with expectation. The chest creaked open of its own accord as I neared, the lid rising slowly, revealing a hollow space inside. And there, at the very bottom, was something I never thought I'd see. A knife. A long, curved blade, dark and stained with something I couldn't identify. The hilt was wrapped in leather, and the blade itself gleamed with an unnatural sharpness. It was the key to completing the ritual. The final piece. And as I reached for it, my heart thudded painfully in my chest. I picked it up, the coldness of the steel sending a shock through my arm, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to stop. The curse had already claimed me, and there was no turning back. The whispers started again, louder this time, growing in intensity. I could hear the cries, the pleas, the screams of those who had come before me, the ones who had been consumed by the curse. And I understood, in that moment, that they weren't gone. They were still there, trapped, lost in the same eternal hunger that would consume me next. I turned toward the figure, the thing waiting for me, and raised the knife. And in that instant, I understood that the curse had already won. It started with a question. Or maybe it was just my imagination. Why did those symbols feel familiar? I was walking down one of the older streets in the city, the kind that seemed untouched by time. Cracked cobblestones, the heavy scent of damp stone, and buildings that leaned over me like silent witnesses of something long forgotten. The city had changed over the years, but here, in these narrow alleyways, the past felt close, too close. At first, I barely noticed them. The symbols. Strange, blinding marks on the walls, faint but deliberate, as if written in ink that only revealed itself under the right light. My eyes caught the patterns without me even thinking about it. I kept walking. The streets twisted and narrowed, and with every corner I turned, the feeling grew stronger. Something was watching me. A gust of wind passed through, carrying the scent of something burnt, something old. I shivered. It wasn't cold, but the air had a weight to it, a stillness that didn't belong. Then I heard it. A whisper. Not a voice, not really. More like the sound of something shifting behind me, just at the edge of my hearing. I stopped. Listened. Nothing but the distant hum of the city beyond these old streets. My fingers brushed against the wall beside me. The stone was rough, uneven. But as I traced one of the symbols, something strange happened. The texture beneath my fingertips changed, smooth, almost slick, as if the wall had turned into something else. Something alive. I pulled my hand away. My heart pounded. The feeling passed, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I had just disturbed something. I turned a corner and nearly collided with an old man. His clothes were worn, his skin lined with age, but it was his eyes that caught me off guard, wide, alert, and staring at me like he knew something. You saw them, didn't you? His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. I hesitated. Saw what? The man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He muttered something under his breath, then stepped past me, disappearing into the alleyway before I could say anything else. I stood there, the silence stretching around me. The symbols were everywhere now. They had always been there, hadn't they? Hidden in plain sight. And then, for the first time, I wondered who had put them there. And why did I feel like they were meant for me? I stood frozen in place, my breath shallow. The symbols stretched along the walls, curling and twisting in patterns too intricate to be meaningless. The old man had vanished into the shadows of the alleyway, leaving behind only his words, still echoing in my mind. You saw them, didn't you? A nervous laugh almost escaped my lips. It was ridiculous. Just some old graffiti, some forgotten markings worn down by time. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. I took a step forward, then another. The street ahead narrowed, the buildings pressing in on me like they were leaning closer, listening. My footsteps sounded wrong, too sharp, too hollow. The city had always been noisy, full of distant chatter, honking cars, the hum of life. But here, in this forgotten part of town, silence reigned. Even the wind seemed hesitant, curling around corners like it didn't want to disturb whatever lingered in these alleyways. I ran my fingers over another symbol. The texture was wrong again, slick, like damp ink, even though the wall itself was dry. My pulse quickened. Then, I noticed something else. The symbols weren't just random. They repeated. The same pattern, the same curves and lines appearing over and over again. Some larger, some smaller, but always the same sequence. Like a message. A warning. A chill crawled up my spine. I turned sharply, half expecting to see the old man still watching me. But the alley behind me was empty. Too empty. The air felt thick, heavy, like I had stepped into a space that wasn't entirely my own. Then, a sound. A slow, deliberate scratch, like nails dragging across stone. It came from above. I tilted my head back, my breath catching in my throat. The rooftops loomed high above, swallowed by darkness. I saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my sight, only grew stronger. I took a step back. My heel hit something soft. I spun around. A small bundle of cloth lay on the ground, crumpled and forgotten. At first, I thought it was just trash, but something about it made my stomach twist. Carefully, I crouched down and reached out. The fabric was old, stiff with time. I hesitated, then pulled it open. Inside, I found a handful of dried leaves, blackened, crumbling. And beneath them, something cold and smooth. A ring. Silver, but tarnished, its surface etched with the same symbols that covered the walls. My breath hitched. It was the same pattern. Again. I stood quickly, scanning the alleyway. The silence pressed in tighter. My hands felt unsteady as I turned the ring over in my palm. There was something written on the inside, the letters faded but still visible. A single word. A name. But before I could read it, the sound came again. Scratching. Closer this time. And then, just beyond the edge of my vision, something moved. I spun around, my breath shallow, the tarnished ring clenched in my palm. The movement had been quick, just at the periphery of my vision, a blur of something dark shifting between the shadows. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. The alley stretched out before me, lined with decaying brick walls and rusted fire escapes. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But the silence itself felt wrong, as if the city had exhaled and forgotten to breathe again. I forced myself to look down at the ring, my fingers trembling. The inscription inside was barely legible, the letters worn down by time. I tilted it towards the dim streetlight, trying to make out the name. N. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the alley, cold and sharp, like a breath against my skin. The dried leaves in the bundle scattered, spiraling upwards before disappearing into the darkness. And then another sound. A whisper. It wasn't in my head. It wasn't the wind. It came from somewhere nearby. I turned slowly, scanning the alley. The graffiti symbols on the walls seemed darker now, more pronounced, as if they had absorbed the shadows around them. The shapes twisted, their curves warping like ink spreading through water. I blinked, and they were still. But the feeling of being watched was stronger now, pressing against me like an unseen weight. I took a cautious step forward, my fingers tightening around the ring. My shadow stretched long across the pavement, flickering slightly. But there was no light source behind me. Panic coiled in my stomach. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the uneven pavement, the old brick walls, the rusted dumpster at the alley's end. I swept the light slowly, right, left, up. Then I saw it. A handprint. Smudged onto the wall and something dark, the fingers long and spindly, the palms slightly elongated. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. The whisper came again, closer this time. A single word, just at the edge of comprehension. Leave. Every muscle in my body screamed to me to run. But I couldn't move. My gaze locked onto the handprint, my mind racing. The shape was unnatural. The fingers were too long, the proportions slightly off. And worse, there was more than one. I lifted the flashlight higher. The entire wall was covered in them. Handprints. Dozens. Some faint, others fresh. All reaching outward. And then, in the center of them, a shape I hadn't noticed before, a figure, drawn in the same dark substance, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Its arms were long, stretching downward, its fingers extended towards the ground. But the most disturbing part was its face. There wasn't one. Just a blank void where eyes and a mouth should have been. The air around me thickened. My breathing grew shallow. Then, the figure moved. Not a trick of the light. Not my imagination. It shifted. A slow, deliberate tilt of the head. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone. My pulse roared in my ears. The walls seemed to close in, the handprints pressing toward me. The symbols swam in my vision, the patterns overlapping, twisting. The whisper turned into something else now, a low, distorted murmur, growing louder, curling around me like a tide. I forced myself to turn, to run. But the alley had changed. The entrance behind me was gone. Only darkness remained. I spun around, my pulse hammering in my ears. The alleyway, once a straight and narrow path back to the main street, was now a suffocating corridor of shifting darkness. The buildings on either side loomed taller than before, their surfaces warping, the bricks seeming to breathe in the dim light. This isn't real. It can't be. I gripped the phone tighter, my flashlight's beam trembling as I swept it across the alley. The wall where I had seen the faceless figure was empty now, Only the strange handprints remained, scattered like a warning. But I knew what I saw. And worse, I could still feel it. Something was here with me. The air was dense, heavy with a scent I couldn't place. Not rot, not mold, but something ancient, like pages of a book that should have crumbled centuries ago. It clung to my skin, to my breath. The whispering hadn't stopped. It was no longer just one voice. A chorus of murmurs pressed against my ears, overlapping, growing louder. Some words were unintelligible, distorted by the echoes of the alley. Others were disturbingly clear. You shouldn't have seen it. Turn back. It knows you now. A cold weight settled in my gut. I had to move. Standing here, frozen, was exactly whatever it was, wanted. I took a slow, careful step forward, my sneakers scraping against the uneven pavement. The sound felt deafening. The darkness ahead seemed thicker than it should be. It wasn't just night, it was something else. Something alive. I aimed my flashlight at it. The beam cut through the void, revealing the walls that should have led me back to safety. But they weren't walls anymore. They were covered in symbols. More of the same marks I had seen before, but now they pulsed, shifting under my gaze like ink bleeding through paper. Some of them I recognized from old texts, alchemical sigils, runes of protection, warnings. But others were wrong. They curved and twisted in ways that made my head ache just looking at them. And then, between the symbols, I saw something else. A shadow. Not just any shadow. It had form. A tall, elongated figure standing at the far end of the alley. Motionless. Silent. It wasn't cast by anything. There was no light source to create it. And yet, it stretched across the wall, its edges flickering like candlelight. I sucked in a breath. The whispers surged, a wave of overlapping voices pressing in. Don't look at it. It sees you. Run. But I couldn't. Because at that moment, the shadow stepped forward. And the ground beneath my feet shifted. The pavement cracked, the lines of reality themselves distorting as if the world was unraveling. My vision blurred, nausea twisting in my stomach. The alley was folding in on itself, the walls stretching, the symbols pulsing like open wounds. I stumbled back, but my legs felt sluggish, like I was moving through thick air. The shadow took another step. And another. And then, it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was here. A cold breath brushed against my neck. The phone in my hand died. The flashlight blinked out, plunging me into absolute darkness. I turned, ready to run. But fingers, cold, impossibly long fingers, brushed against my wrist. And a voice, clear and unmistakable, whispered into my ear. Now you belong to it. The touch was ice against my skin. Not just cold, wrong. As if something was reaching through the fabric of reality itself to grip me. My breath caught in my throat, my body rigid with primal terror. The fingers didn't feel human. Too long. Too thin. And they didn't just touch me, they curled around my wrist, pressing down with an unnatural weight, as though they weren't just resting on my flesh, but sinking through it. I gasped and yanked my arm back. But the moment I moved, the world twisted. The alley collapsed inward like a collapsing tunnel, the walls warping, symbols stretching across the darkness in fluid motion. The shadow, the thing, was no longer just at the far end of the alley. It was everywhere. It was around me. The darkness thickened, pressing in, filling my lungs like smoke. My ears rang with whispers, their words indistinct but laced with a cruel, knowing malice. The pavement beneath my feet shifted, cracking and stretching as if I was standing on something alive. And then, a breath. Not mine. Right next to my ear. It knows your name. A shiver ripped through me. I turned too fast, and my vision blurred, my balance faltering. The alley was spinning, distorting. For a split second, I saw something in the dark, a shape, tall and thin, its form flickering like a dying flame. Not a man. Not a shadow. Something in between. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the uneven pavement. My phone, useless and dead, slipped from my grip, hitting the ground with a dull clack. I barely heard it, because the whispers had stopped. The silence was worse. I could feel something staring at me, watching, measuring, and then a sound. Not a voice, not a whisper, a click, like teeth snapping together. A sharp, deliberate sound, impossibly close. Then another click, and another. Faster, closer, surrounding me. It wasn't speaking anymore. It was grinning. I ran. My body finally obeyed, legs propelling me forward, heart hammering against my ribs. The alley stretched before me, impossibly long, the buildings leaning inward as if trying to swallow me whole. My breath was ragged, my vision blurred, but I didn't stop. The ground rippled beneath my feet. The symbols on the walls burned with a sickly, pulsing light. The darkness twisted, shifting, chasing. And then, the alley ended. I burst onto the main street, the city swallowing me in a rush of light and noise. The world snapped back into place, cars, neon signs, the distant hum of life. I spun around. The alley was gone. Not just empty, gone. A solid brick wall stood where the entrance should have been, as if the alley had never existed. No symbols. No shadows. Just a blank, lifeless surface. I staggered back, my breath coming in uneven gasps. The street was normal. People walked past me, their faces indifferent, unaware of the nightmare I had just escaped. Had I escaped? I looked down at my wrist. Where the fingers had touched me, the skin was cold. A dull ache pulsed beneath the surface, like a bruise forming from the inside out. And there, etched into my flesh, was a mark. A symbol. One of the same ones I had seen on the walls. A shudder crawled through me. It hadn't let me go. It had marked me. And as I stood there, my pulse hammering, I felt something shift in the air. A whisper. Not from the alley. Not from behind me. From inside my head. You are one of us now. The first time I heard it, I thought it was the wind. It was a soft, whispering sound, threading through the silence of my apartment like a breath slipping through unseen lips. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering, my ears straining against the dark. The room was still, the faint glow of the street lamp outside stretching long shadows across the walls. Nothing moved. Maybe it had been a trick of my mind, some half-dream conjured by exhaustion. I told myself that and lay back down. But sleep didn't come easily. I had broken the rule. It was a simple rule, one that had been passed down for generations. A tradition, They called it a ritual, some whispered. Whatever it was, I had ignored it. I had laughed at it, brushed it aside as nothing more than superstition. Now, something was watching. The next night, the whispers came again. This time, closer. I woke up with a start, my body frozen in the cocoon of my sheets. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside. Somewhere in the room. A slow, dragging hush, like dry leaves scraping against stone. I forced myself to turn my head, scanning the darkness. The street lamp flickered, its glow dimming for just a moment, long enough for the shadows to shift. There. A shape, standing in the corner. My breath caught. It wasn't fully formed, more like a disturbance in the air, an outline where something should be. It didn't move, but I could feel it looking at me. I shut my eyes. This isn't real. This isn't happening. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. When I finally dared to look again, nothing. The corner was empty. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The following days passed in a blur of exhaustion. I carried the weight of sleepless nights, my nerves stretched thin. The city moved around me in its usual rhythm, cars honking, people talking, life continuing as if nothing was wrong. But the whispers never left. They followed me. In the stairwell of my building, where the air felt too still. In the reflection of windows, where something shifted just beyond my sight. In the hush of my apartment, where the silence had learned to breathe. I wasn't alone. And worse, I knew it was only beginning. I didn't sleep. Even after the whispers faded and the door remained shut, I sat awake in my bed, my back pressed against the cold wall, listening. Every creak of the building, every distant honk from the street below made me flinch. My body was rigid with exhaustion, but my mind wouldn't shut down. What if it came back? What if it was still here? At some point, dawn bled through the blinds, weak and gray. Morning should have brought relief, but the air in my apartment remained stale, heavy. It clung to my skin like damp cloth. I finally forced myself to move. Routine. Focus on routine. I showered, the scalding water doing little to chase away the chill embedded in my bones. In the mirror, I looked worse than I felt, pale, dark circles under my eyes, a haunted expression that didn't belong to me. Get a grip. By the time I sat down at my desk with a cup of coffee, my hands had stopped shaking. But I couldn't focus. The events of the night coiled inside my skull, refusing to loosen their grip. The whispers. The knocking. The turning doorknob. I reached for my phone, scrolling aimlessly, anything to distract myself. That's when I noticed something odd. A missed call. Unknown number. 3 a.m. My stomach tightened. I hadn't heard my phone ring. No voicemail, no text, just that single, unanswered call. I tapped the number. It rang once, then cut to silence. I pulled the phone away from my ear, heart hammering. No dial tone. No disconnection message. Just silence. A chill crawled down my spine. Then my phone buzzed. I nearly dropped it. The same number. Calling me back. My thumb hovered over the screen. Answering felt like a mistake, but ignoring it felt worse. I swiped. I pressed the phone to my ear, swallowing the lump in my throat. Hello? Silence. No static, no background noise. Just an emptiness that felt alive. Then, a whisper, not from the phone, from behind me. I spun, nearly knocking over my coffee. The apartment was empty. The air felt wrong again, thick and oppressive. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts. The whisper had been right there. My phone slipped from my hand, hitting the desk with a dull thud. And then, the screen lit up. New message. I hesitated, then tapped it open. My chest tightened as I read the single word on the screen. Listen. A sharp, cold knock echoed from the front door. 3 times. Just like last night. The knocks were sharp. Precise. 3 of them. I sat frozen, my body locked in place, my breathing shallow. The phone was still in my hand, the word listen glaring back at me from the screen. I couldn't look away. Another knock. Softer this time. It's the same as last night. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to stay put, to pretend I wasn't home, but my legs moved on their own. Slow. Careful. The floor felt colder under my feet as I approached the door, heart pounding so hard I thought it might shake the walls. I didn't turn the knob. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, listening. Silence. For a moment, I thought, hoped that whoever was out there had left. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe a breath right on the other side of the door. I sucked in air sharply, a cold shiver rushing down my spine. It wasn't just a breath, it was long, deliberate, as if someone was pressing their face against the wood, inhaling me. I stumbled back. The phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. I looked. Open. No. No, no, no. I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around the phone. This was a trick. It had to be. Some sick prank. A hacker. A mistake. I turned away from the door. The moment I did, the handle turned. A metallic click. Not locked. My breath hitched. I never unlocked it. The door didn't open. It just shifted. Like something on the other side was testing it. Another message. The screen burned against my palm. If you don't listen, IT will. I felt my stomach drop. It will what? My eyes darted back to the door. Still shut. Then, the whisper. It came from inside the apartment. Behind me. I turned so fast my vision blurred. The room was empty. But the air had changed, thick with something I couldn't name. The walls felt closer. The shadows darker. The whisper came again. Not words, something else. A sound crawling beneath my skin. Like breath dragged over shattered glass. I backed away, my chest tightening, my ears ringing. Another buzz. I forced myself to look. Don't run. A cold gust rushed through the apartment. The door behind me slammed shut. And then, for the first time, I heard my own voice whisper back. From somewhere else in the room. The whisper, my voice, echoed through the room, and I couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed, staring at the space where the sound had come from, my own breath catching in my throat. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be me. I hadn't spoken. I turned, eyes scanning every corner of the room, every shadow. There was nothing there. The walls looked the same, familiar, ordinary. But nothing felt right anymore. The air was thicker now, suffocating. It pressed against me, as if someone was watching, waiting. The silence stretched, heavy and unbearable. Then, that whisper again. Listen. I spun towards the source of the sound. My heart hammered in my chest. No one was there. I was alone. But the air was changing. There was something in it, a presence, like the very space around me was shifting. I took a step forward, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body felt numb, as though I were moving underwater. The room felt smaller, too close, like it was folding in on itself. I glanced at the door. The lock was still undone. It wasn't just the door, I could hear something else now. A sound that didn't belong here. It started low, a scratching noise. At first, it was distant. Soft, like nails dragging across stone. But it grew louder, closer. And then, faster. I froze. The sound seemed to pulse, to move, and in the space between one scrape and the next, I could almost make out a voice, faint, breathless, but there was no one here. There couldn't be. The phone buzzed again. The screen flashed in the dim light of the apartment. Listen. I couldn't think. My hands shook as I reached for it. I had to understand. The message was gone. But there was something else, something more. A photo. A dark figure standing in the doorway, just a blur, a shadow, but its presence was undeniable. It was watching me. The air felt cold, sharp like ice. I stared at the image, my pulse thrumming in my ears. The figure was close. Too close. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. Complete silence. And then, a knock. Soft. Repetitive. It felt wrong. Like it had already happened. I'm dreaming, right? The thought clung to me, desperate, as I turned toward the door. My eyes felt heavy. My chest too tight. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. I wanted to wake up. But when the knock came again, I didn't move. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. Then, the door opened. Not slowly. Not quietly. But with the force of something that had been waiting too long to be released. Have you ever had a night that changed everything? The kind of night that makes you question if you were ever truly awake in the first place? I'll never forget the night it happened. It began like any other, quiet, uneventful, the kind of evening where the world seems to breathe in slow, steady rhythms. The kind of night that should have been peaceful. But that night, something was different. Something that seemed out of place. It was already late when I stepped inside my small apartment, the door creaking slightly as I closed it behind me. The dim light from the street lamp outside barely reached in, casting long shadows across the room. Everything seemed normal at first. The quiet hum of the fridge. The distant sound of traffic from the street below. But then, there was that sound. A soft, almost imperceptible scratching noise. It came from the corner of the room, near the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind brushing against the wood. But then it came again, closer this time. A deliberate sound, not random at all. I turned toward the corner, my eyes narrowing. Nothing. The room was empty. I shook my head, trying to push away the feeling that something was wrong. It's just your imagination, I thought. It's late. You're tired. I walked into the kitchen, the fluorescent lights flickering above me. As I opened the fridge to grab a drink, I heard it again, this time louder. The scratch. But there was something more to it. It sounded like it was moving. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just the wind. I stepped back into the living room, glancing around. My heart was starting to race. The apartment felt off. The air had thickened, and the silence felt oppressive. It wasn't until I looked at the door, still locked behind me, that I realized how still everything had become. The sound outside? Gone. But the unease lingered, hanging in the air like smoke, suffocating everything around me. I glanced toward the hallway. The shadows seemed deeper, more defined. But nothing was there. Not a soul. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself. I'm just tired. But just then, I heard the noise again, this time closer. Not from the corner. From behind me. I turned too fast. My heart was pounding in my chest. But no one was there. Then, the sound changed. It was no longer a scratch, it was a step. A heavy, deliberate footstep. And then another. I stood frozen, unable to breathe. It was coming from the hallway. Someone was inside the apartment with me. I couldn't think. My mind was racing. Who could it be? I hadn't heard anyone come in. There was no one at the door when I arrived. I stepped forward, my body moving without my consent. And that's when I heard it, a soft whisper. Listen. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't in my head. Someone, something, was here. Right behind me. I spun around. The room was still empty. But now, the silence was broken. Something was in the air, thick and oppressive. A presence. And that whisper, it was growing louder. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Was it a trick of the mind? No. I could feel it. It was real. I backed into the kitchen, my pulse pounding. I looked around, anything to make sense of it. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, mocking me with its steady rhythm. But everything felt wrong. Why was I alone? The whisper came again. Listen. This time, I turned toward the door. Had it always been locked? I didn't remember checking. The faintest glimmer of doubt crept into my mind, but I shoved it aside. This was my apartment. I was alone. But when I reached the door, I hesitated. There was no sound now. Nothing. Just the pounding of my own heartbeat. But as I slowly opened the door, I noticed something on the floor, a small, twisted shape just barely visible beneath the crack. It was a broken piece of something. Something that felt familiar. It was a ring. I crouched down, my fingers trembling as I reached for it. The metal was cold against my skin. And the moment I touched it, a strange shiver passed through me, like I had just made contact with something alive. I stood up slowly, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. My breath was shallow. The room felt colder now, the shadows creeping in at the edges of my vision. And then, the whisper returned. This time, it wasn't behind me. It was inside my head. Don't forget. I closed my eyes, clutching the ring in my hand. The air seemed to warp around me. My chest tightened, and the walls felt like they were closing in. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here. But when I turned to run, I realized the door had already closed. The door. It was closed. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity. My fingers, still clutching the cold ring, trembled. The room felt suffocating, as if the very air around me had thickened. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I hadn't heard the door close. I hadn't heard a single sound, no click, no creak of the hinges. It had just shut. On its own. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe I was just imagining it. But no, this was different. The whisper had been too real. Too close. I could feel it in my bones. My heartbeat drummed against my chest, every beat seeming louder than the last. I turned away from the door, looking for something, anything, that could make sense of this. The shadows around me seemed darker now, as though they were stretching, bending, consuming everything in sight. And the air. It was colder. No, it wasn't just the temperature, it was something else. The air felt wrong. It had weight to it, as if it was pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. I could taste it, metallic and bitter, like iron on the back of my tongue. I tried to steady my breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Focus. The room was too quiet. It felt as if the world outside had ceased to exist entirely. The faint hum of the refrigerator was gone. The sounds of the street, cars, voices, the occasional siren had disappeared. Nothing. I walked toward the window, the ring still clutched in my hand. I needed to see outside, to remind myself that this was real. I reached for the curtains and pulled them back. Nothing. No cars. No lights. The street was empty. Completely empty. And then I noticed it. A figure. Standing across the street, just at the edge of the shadows. It was too dark to make out any details, but I knew it was there. Watching. I felt my throat tighten, my breath catching. Who was it? My legs moved without thinking. I took a step forward, but just before I reached the door, I heard the whisper again. This time, it was louder. Look. I froze. The whisper wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't even coming from the room. It was in my head, a voice that seemed to echo from deep within me, rattling my bones. I looked at the window once more, trying to fight the urge to turn away. The figure was still there. But now, it was moving. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't possible. The figure had been standing still, but now it was approaching. Slowly, almost deliberately. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped by the weight of the moment. The figure, no longer a vague shape, was clearer now. It wasn't a person. At least, not entirely. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its face, if you could call it that, was obscured by a mask of shadows, but its eyes, those eyes were wide, empty, like two gaping holes in the night. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure stopped moving. It was staring at me. A cold wave of terror washed over me. The urge to run was overpowering, but my body was paralyzed, my feet glued to the floor. I couldn't look away from those eyes. The emptiness in them seemed to reach into me, pulling out something deep inside. I could feel myself slipping. And then the whisper came again. But this time, it wasn't just a voice. It was a command. Come. The air grew even colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch, reaching toward me, pulling me closer. The ring in my hand grew heavier, colder, as if it were pulling me in, demanding that I listen, that I obey. I shook my head, trying to break free of the hold it had on me. No, this couldn't be happening. I wasn't going to let it. But the whisper, the presence, it was relentless. It was overwhelming. It felt like it was inside my head, digging deeper with every passing second. The darkness outside seemed to draw closer, and the air pressed in on me, suffocating. I forced myself to take a step backward, but it felt like moving through thick mud. The figure outside didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, as if it was filling the room, enveloping me. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to be alive now, writhing, shifting. I could almost hear them, like they were breathing. I snapped. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let whatever this was swallow me whole. With a rush of adrenaline, I turned and ran for the door. My hand fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I twisted, yanked, tried to push, but it was as if the door had become one with the wall, locked, sealed. No escape. I screamed, but it didn't matter. The room had become something else. The walls were closing in, the air too thick to breathe. And then, I felt something cold, sharp, press against the back of my neck. A hand. I spun around, my pulse racing, and there, standing in front of me, was the figure from outside. It was inside. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. It stepped closer. And then, with a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers woven into one, it said, "You shouldn't have looked." I felt a surge of panic. My heart raced, my body trembling with fear. What did it mean? I took a step back, and that's when I saw it, on the floor, at my feet. A trail of broken glass, leading to the center of the room. I looked up. The walls were now completely dark. And the whisper came again. "Don't look." I felt it. Something was watching. Something was waiting. My breath was ragged, my chest heaving, as I stood frozen in place, staring down at the broken glass. The sharp shards reflected dimly in the low light, like 1,000 tiny mirrors, each one showing something different, a fragmented version of reality. What did it mean? I couldn't focus on the glass anymore. It was the thing behind me. The presence that hovered just out of my reach, like a shadow waiting to consume me. The figure, it was closer now, almost standing right in front of me, its tall, spindly form looming, suffocating the space around me. The mask of shadow that hid its face seemed to ripple, like liquid darkness, and the empty, black eyes were locked on mine, staring into me, through me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, too tight to make a sound. My legs felt like lead, unable to move. I was trapped. The whisper came again, soft, but forceful, "Come closer." I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to obey. My body trembled in protest, but my feet moved, dragging me toward the figure. I didn't want to, but it was as if something deep inside me couldn't resist. My hand stretched out, reaching for the air between us, and in that moment, the temperature dropped again, the cold sinking into my bones. Why was I doing this? I couldn't remember. I couldn't think straight. My mind was clouded, as if something were fogging my thoughts, blurring the edges of reality. Every step I took seemed to draw me closer to the thing in front of me, but it also felt like I was falling into a nightmare I couldn't escape from. Then, I heard it again. A sound. A low, grinding noise from somewhere deep in the walls. It was almost like something was moving behind them. I looked around frantically, my mind racing to make sense of the noise, but everything was so wrong, nothing fit. The walls were shifting. Or was it just my mind? I looked back at the figure. It wasn't moving, but it was still there, waiting, its eyes burning into me. I felt like I was suffocating. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't understand. The whisper grew louder, this time clearer. Look. I froze. Look. Look at what? I glanced down at the floor. The trail of broken glass had changed. It was no longer just shards, it had formed a pattern, an intricate, twisted design that spiraled in on itself. It was like a symbol I knew. It was the same as the one I had seen earlier, in the woods, burned into the tree bark. The same one from my dream. I felt the blood drain from my face. No. It can't be. The figure's eyes, those black, empty pits, seemed to glow now, the darkness within them swirling like a vortex. It took a step forward, its long limbs moving impossibly slow, but each motion felt like it took me further from reality. I stepped back. My mind screamed at me to move, but my body wouldn't listen. I was rooted to the spot, my pulse hammering in my ears. The whisper grew more insistent. Look at it. I couldn't fight it anymore. My eyes were drawn to the symbol on the floor, and as I focused on it, I felt something shift. Something shifted inside me. It was like the world around me had bent, twisted, and suddenly, I wasn't standing in my living room anymore. I was back in the forest. The trees surrounded me, tall and thick, their branches intertwining above me, blocking out the sky. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the sound of something moving through the underbrush. No, this wasn't real. I blinked, but the forest remained. The cold, damp air filled my lungs, and I could feel the wetness of the ground beneath my feet. It was too real. I spun around. The figure was gone, but the sense of dread lingered, thick and heavy, crawling up my spine. There was no way this could be happening. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But then, the ground beneath me began to tremble, the earth shifting in unnatural waves, and a crack appeared in the earth before me. From within it, a faint light glowed, sickly green and pulsating. I stepped back, but the ground split wider, revealing a dark void. Something was moving inside it. I could feel it, a presence, something that wasn't quite of this world. And then, from the shadows, I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. More than I could count. They were standing at the edges of the crack, their eyes glowing with the same empty blackness as the figure in my room. They were watching me, waiting. I could feel the air growing thick again. The whisper returned, louder now, a chorus of voices layered on top of each other, saying the same thing. Tom. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my body betrayed me again. I couldn't move. One of the figures stepped forward. It was tall, taller than any human. Its limbs stretched, growing impossibly long, its shadow engulfing the ground beneath it. It moved closer, and with each step, I could feel the world around me warping, distorting. It wasn't just a person. It was something else. Something ancient. It reached out, its long, clawed fingers brushing the air. And then, the world shifted again. I was back in my living room. I gasped for air, my heart racing. I looked around, everything was exactly as it had been. The broken glass. The shadows. The cold. But the figure was there. Right in front of me. Its eyes burned into mine, black as night. And then it spoke, its voice like 1,000 whispers, each one scraping against my mind. It's not over. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The air felt colder now, the shadows deeper. The room was suffocating. And I knew then that I was no longer alone. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. The room was suffocating. The shadows had grown thicker, twisting like smoke curling on itself. My pulse thudded in my ears, loud enough to drown out the world. But I could still hear it, the whisper. So faint, yet so clear. It's not over. I could barely breathe, my lungs feeling like they were collapsing with every desperate gasp of air. My fingers trembled as I reached for anything that might ground me, but the walls were closing in. The glass on the floor, those jagged, glinting pieces, seemed to shift, almost like they were alive, like they were watching me, waiting. I stumbled backward, tripping over the remnants of a broken table. The room around me seemed to stretch, the edges blurring and twisting into impossible angles. The walls, were they breathing? My eyes darted from corner to corner, desperately searching for something, anything, familiar. But everything felt wrong. The figure was still there. It hadn't moved. I tried to make sense of what had happened. How did I get here? Was I still in my apartment? Had I truly left the forest? But none of it made sense. None of it ever would. I glanced toward the window. The streetlights outside flickered, their warm glow casting odd shapes across the floor. But as I looked closer, the shadows they cast didn't seem to match the furniture, didn't seem to make any sense at all. They were moving. My mind was reeling. What was happening to me? I wanted to scream, to run out the door, to escape the suffocating grip of this reality that felt more like a nightmare than anything I'd ever known. But my legs wouldn't move. It was like they were rooted to the floor, and every time I tried to break free, I felt an invisible weight pushing down on me. I forced my eyes to the figure again. It was still staring at me. But now, something was different. Its shape seemed to shift. The darkness around it wasn't just darkness anymore. It was something more, something tangible, pulling at the edges of reality itself. I was losing my grip. I was slipping. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't alone. A chorus of voices joined in, layered upon one another, murmuring incomprehensible words in a language I didn't recognize. 1,000 whispers. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out. This couldn't be real. But when I opened them, the figure was closer. It had taken another step toward me, though I hadn't seen it move. Its presence, it was suffocating, pressing down on me like gravity itself was turned against me. I could barely keep my balance, my vision spinning. The world around me was losing focus, fading in and out, and I could swear the floor was tilting beneath me, as if I were caught in the grip of something enormous, something alive. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, each thought a reminder of the fact that I was still alive, that I hadn't disappeared into whatever nightmare this was. And then, the figure spoke. "You can't escape." I shuddered. The voice was low, guttural, almost like it came from somewhere far, far away, but also from within me. The words sank into my bones, vibrating through me, settling into my chest with a heaviness that stole the breath from my lungs. I tried to move. I had to get away. But something in my mind snapped. I wasn't in control anymore. My body felt foreign to me, like it wasn't mine to command. I looked down at my hands. The veins stood out like thin, dark rivers, the skin pale and trembling. I couldn't feel them. I could barely feel anything. My eyes darted around the room, frantic now, but the room, it was warping. The furniture was changing shape, distorting. The walls, once so familiar, now seemed to pulse with something that wasn't there before, something alive, something that didn't belong. I had to get out. I had to leave this place. But every time I moved toward the door, it seemed further away. The hallway that had once led me to freedom now felt like a maze, its corners bending in impossible directions. I spun around, my back against the door, and that's when I saw it. The shadow. It wasn't cast by the figure anymore. It wasn't cast by anything at all. It was moving. A long, twisting shadow slithered across the floor, stretching toward me like a living thing. It wasn't the shadow of a person. It had no shape, no form. It was pure darkness, an absence that consumed everything in its path. I gasped, backing away, my eyes glued to the writhing blackness. It came closer, faster, the edges of its shape spreading like ink spilling across the floor. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. The figure, the thing that had been in the corner of my vision, was gone, replaced by this creature. It was massive. The darkness seemed to take shape in front of me, its presence pressing in from all sides. I could feel it wrapping around me, slowly constricting. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could feel was the cold, suffocating weight of it, like being pulled into the abyss. And then, I heard the voice again. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream. My scream. I bolted upright. The darkness vanished. I was in my apartment again. But this time, the silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive. Everything felt wrong. My body was shaking. I couldn't trust what I was seeing anymore. Was it real? Was any of it real? Or was I losing my mind, trapped in a nightmare with no way out? I looked at the door. It was still there. But beyond it, I could hear something. A rustling. Slow. Steady. The sound of something moving. The rustling sound grew louder, sharper. My heart pounded in my chest, a heavy, relentless drumbeat. Something was out there. I pressed my back against the wall, my fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe. The floor beneath me felt like it was shifting with every breath I took, as if the very foundation of the apartment was beginning to crumble, threatening to swallow me whole. No. I couldn't let that happen. I had to make a choice. I swallowed hard, fighting to control the panic rising in my throat. Each inhale felt like it was dragging me deeper into the suffocating void of this place. The silence was a lie. The sound of movement beyond the door, it was real. It was undeniable. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't just wait it out. But the question still lingered. What was out there? I glanced back toward the window. The faint light from the street outside had disappeared, swallowed by the blackened sky. The room felt like it was shrinking. The walls, the very air around me, seemed to press in with a force I couldn't escape. I took a step toward the door, then another. But my legs were shaky, unwilling to cooperate. The trembling in my hands grew worse, and I nearly lost my balance. The rustling stopped. Absolute silence. I froze, waiting for the sound to return. But it didn't. Instead, something else began to move. Slowly. The door. I watched as the handle began to turn, the movement so subtle that it almost felt like I imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. There was no mistaking it. Something was trying to get in. I backed away. My mind raced, spinning with thoughts I couldn't keep up with. Do I open the door? Do I run? The door creaked. The soft scraping sound made my blood run cold. It was too late to escape. The door burst open. I gasped, my body frozen in place, unable to react. It wasn't a person. The thing that stepped into the doorway was unnatural. It was tall, too tall, its silhouette jagged and grotesque. It seemed to distort the space around it, bending the light in a way that made it appear as though it was not entirely present in this world. I could see shadows flickering, rippling like a broken mirror, as if the very air around it refused to hold still. The thing's features were indistinct, its form shifting constantly, making it impossible to focus on anything solid. It was like looking at something through water, distorted, moving, wrong. But there was one thing I could see clearly, its eyes. They weren't eyes at all. They were black, infinite voids, gaping holes where there should have been light. And they were fixed on me. A cold, horrible sensation crawled up my spine. The urge to run, to escape, was overwhelming, but my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, rooted to the floor by an invisible weight. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. My mouth was dry, my lips cracked. It was like my own body had turned against me. The creature took a step forward. Then another. It was moving slowly, deliberately, as though it had all the time in the world. I could feel the air shift with each movement, like gravity itself was bending to its will. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't just whispers. They were louder, voices pressing against my mind, clamoring to be heard. It's too late. You can't run. You can never escape. I forced my legs to move. One step, then another, backing away as the thing closed in. The air around it felt like ice, biting at my skin. I could feel it, its presence, bearing down on me, suffocating me from all sides. And then it spoke. You thought you could run. You thought you could hide. Its voice was like gravel scraping across stone, low, guttural, and thick with menace. I could feel it vibrating through my bones, rattling every nerve. The words were both inside and outside my head at once, as though they were imprinted into my mind. I was so close to the window, I could almost touch it. But the thing was between me and the only possible way out. I turned. I had no other choice. I had to escape. But as I reached for the window, the glass cracked. Not from the outside. From the inside. It was like the entire room had been turned upside down. The walls began to bend. The ceiling was no longer above me, it was beside me. The floor tilted violently beneath my feet, pulling me toward the cracked glass like a magnet. The weight of the room, the pressure, was unbearable. The air felt thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I glanced back at the doorway. The creature was gone, but its presence lingered, suffusing the very air with something cold and suffocating. I staggered toward the window, struggling to keep my balance. The cracks in the glass widened, and I could see the dark sky outside, far too far away. But I had to escape. I pressed my hand against the glass, feeling the coldness seep into my skin. I pushed hard. The glass shattered, the pieces falling outward into the void. The sound echoed in my ears, deafening. And then I jumped. I fell through the glass, through the air, but everything was distorted, everything was wrong. The ground below me wasn't the ground anymore, it was just more darkness, stretching on forever. My heart was still racing. The terror hadn't left me. It followed me. And I realized, with a horrifying certainty, that no matter how far I ran, it would never stop. I was never going to escape. The darkness was already here. Have you ever felt that something was watching you, even when you were completely alone? I don't mean the fleeting thought that crosses your mind in a dark room, or the paranoid suspicion that creeps in during a quiet night. No, I mean something deeper, something that lingers long after the light has returned, something that never leaves. It started after one of those ordinary nights when I came home later than usual after a routine walk through the empty streets. The air was cold, almost biting, as if the world itself had decided to retreat into winter's embrace a little too early. I didn't think much of it. Life had its regular challenges, and this walk was just another way to keep my mind clear. But as I passed the familiar trees and dim streetlights, something strange began to settle in. It wasn't a sound at first. It wasn't a voice or a shadow. It was the feeling that I was not alone. I shrugged it off at first, but as I walked through the silent street, each step seemed to echo louder in my ears, like the entire world was holding its breath. The sound of my shoes scraping against the pavement was replaced by something else, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling, like footsteps following my own. My head snapped back, but there was nothing there. The street was empty, just like it had been a moment before. Yet, the sensation never faded. If anything, it grew stronger, the unseen presence pressing in from all directions, its weight heavier than the silence around me. I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself that it was nothing. A trick of my tired mind. But when I reached my apartment building, the feeling didn't let go. It followed me inside, into the narrow hallway where shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far. My footsteps became muffled as I moved quickly towards the door, the feeling of being watched becoming unbearable. I made it inside, slammed the door behind me, and leaned against it for a moment. Safe, at last. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling. It was as if someone was standing just beyond the walls, staring through the cracks, waiting for me to notice. I sat down, trying to breathe, telling myself that I had simply imagined it. Yet the silence in the apartment felt thick, almost suffocating, as though it were closing in on me. I could hear nothing but the steady thumping of my own heartbeat, which grew louder, more frantic with every passing second. I tried to distract myself. I turned on the TV, flicked through some old books, and even tried to focus on my work. But the feeling of being watched never left. The rustling that had followed me outside seemed to have invaded my apartment, following me room to room as if it had no intention of letting me escape. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but all I saw were the silent, empty corners of the room. Then it happened. A soft creak. I froze, my blood running cold. It came from the hallway again. At first, it sounded like the floorboards giving way under some unseen weight. Then, just as quickly, it turned into a step. Slow and deliberate, as if something, was making its way toward me, one step at a time. I told myself it was just the building settling. But the air felt thick, almost oppressive, and the temperature dropped a few degrees in a matter of seconds. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to even blink. My eyes stayed glued to the narrow hallway just beyond the door to the living room. Another step. Closer now. I couldn't explain it. It didn't make sense. I was alone. I had to be alone. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. The shadows seemed to warp as I approached the hallway. I was drawn to it, pulled by a force I couldn't resist, as if something inside me knew I had to face what was coming. But with each step, I felt the weight of something else growing closer, moving just behind me, never quite there, but always too close. The air in the hallway seemed thicker, the shadows darker. I couldn't tell where they ended or where the walls began. It was as if the space had stretched unnaturally, closing in on me, trapping me inside. Then, there it was. The unmistakable sound of a footstep on the wood floor, so close now that I could feel the vibration in the pit of my stomach. My heart skipped a beat, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. But when I spun around, nothing was there. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before. My chest tightened with fear, and I felt my breath quicken. I backed away slowly, telling myself it had to be a trick of my mind, a result of exhaustion or maybe stress. But then, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate creak, and another step. I froze. In that moment, I felt something shift in the room. The shadows in the corners of my vision seemed to twitch, to move just slightly, as though they were waiting for something. For me. I turned, ready to run, but I felt the ground beneath me shift, as if the apartment was tilting, bending towards something far worse than my own fear. The room had changed, it wasn't the same, and neither was I. This presence, this thing, wasn't just watching. It was waiting, and it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I don't know how long I stood there in that darkened hallway, my body frozen in place, every muscle screaming to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The creaking stopped, but that didn't bring me any relief. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, because I could still feel it. I could still feel it. I told myself that it had to be my imagination. I was just tired. Maybe I'd been working too hard, my mind playing tricks on me. But even as I thought that, I knew deep down that something was wrong. That wasn't just an ordinary creak. That wasn't just the house settling. No, someone was here with me. I forced my legs to move, stepping cautiously toward the source of the sound, toward the darkened hallway. The air seemed colder now, as if the temperature itself had been dragged down by some unseen force. The floor beneath me felt different, damp, almost. My feet made no noise as they pressed against the boards, the usual creaks and groans of the house swallowed up by a silence that pressed in on me from all sides. The shadows were deeper now, darker than they had been before. They seemed to stretch and curl around me like dark fingers, reaching out to grab me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer in control of the space around me, that the hallway itself was alive, shifting and pulsing with an energy I couldn't understand. I reached the doorframe, where the hallway opened into the living room, and paused, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, and my breath came out in short, shaky bursts. The silence that surrounded me felt unnatural, as if the world had gone still, waiting for something to happen. And then, I heard it again. A whisper. I turned quickly, heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. No one in the hallway. But the whisper. It had come from behind me. My body screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs were rooted to the spot. The darkness felt alive, a suffocating presence creeping over me, pulling me deeper into its hold. I could see nothing, just the impenetrable blackness that swallowed the light from the nearby lamp. I strained my eyes, trying to make out any movement, but it was no use. The shadows were too thick, too oppressive. And then it moved. I saw something. A figure, standing at the end of the hallway, just barely visible through the darkness. At first, I thought it was a trick of my eyes, a shadow cast by the dim light. But no! It was moving. Slowly. With purpose. It wasn't a person. It was something else. The figure didn't have a clear shape, just a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to shift and distort with every moment. It moved without sound, without any sign of life, just this unnatural, horrible presence inching closer, almost gliding through the hallway. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away from it. The air grew colder still, the room now completely silent except for the faint sound of my rapid breathing. The walls seemed to press in, closing off the space, making it smaller, tighter. The figure was closer now, too close. It was right in front of me. I could feel its presence, its cold, suffocating presence, so close that I could barely breathe. The shadows around me thickened, twisting into something monstrous. The thing was so close, I could almost make out details, but they were all wrong. Its form shifted, melted, never staying still for more than a moment. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my voice lost in the cold, oppressive air that surrounded me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was trapped. And then, in the silence, I heard it again. A whisper. This time, I could make out the words. You shouldn't have come. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't even a human voice. It was something deeper, older, a voice that felt like it had been pulled from the very darkness itself. My chest tightened, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs. I could feel the cold creeping inside me, a chill that wasn't from the temperature of the room, but from something much deeper. I tried to move again, my legs shaking beneath me. The figure, or whatever it was still there, watching me with its dark, ever-shifting form. The air felt thick, suffocating, like I was trapped in a dream from which I couldn't wake. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The figure was gone. The room was still. The silence was unbearable. I don't know how long I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest, my body frozen with fear. The presence was gone, but I still felt it, that watching, that sense that something was there, waiting, lurking just beyond my sight. I turned slowly, the shadows seeming to follow me, and hurried back to the living room, heart racing with every step. I shut the door behind me, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. The silence that filled the room was suffocating, but at least it was real. Or was it? I looked around, desperately trying to make sense of what had just happened. The furniture was where it had always been, the room as ordinary as any room could be. But something had changed. The air felt wrong. The silence felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. I backed away from the door, slowly. My eyes darted around the room, every corner seeming to hide something, every shadow seeming to stretch just a little too far. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. But the more I thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. The whispering, the figure. It couldn't have been real. But then, I caught sight of something. On the floor, near the corner of the room. A dark smudge. And when I knelt to look closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a footprint. But it wasn't mine. And there was no way that it should have been there. I stared at the footprint, my mind racing to find a logical explanation. The floor was old, creaky, and often left marks from dust or dirt, but this was something different. This wasn't a shadow or a mark from the furniture. This was a distinct imprint, as if someone or something had actually stepped here. I ran my fingers along the edges of the footprint. It was large, the heel deep and the toes pointed forward, as though it had been left there just moments ago. The impression felt wet, still fresh, but there was no moisture on the ground. No dampness in the air. Only the stifling silence that seemed to press in on me from all directions. I slowly stood up, my head spinning. I had to be imagining things. I had to be. But as I looked around the room again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That thing, the dark figure, it was still here. In some form, it was still watching me. I backed away from the mark on the floor, the panic rising in my chest like a tidal wave. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The silence was suffocating, and yet it was as if the space itself was pulsing, alive with something I couldn't explain. The shadows seemed to stretch again, but this time they weren't just on the walls. They were on the floor too. I swore I saw something move in the corner of my eye, just at the edge of the light. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Just the usual quiet emptiness. I blinked, trying to force my mind to focus, trying to shake off the wave of fear that was threatening to overtake me. But the feeling, the cold, oppressive presence, was unmistakable. It was real. The whispering, the figure, the footprint. It was all real. I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself. The rational part of my brain told me to leave, to get out. But I couldn't. I couldn't just walk away. What if it followed me? What if I left and it would be there, waiting for me, wherever I went? And so, I stayed. In this suffocating silence. In this house that no longer felt like a home. I tried to tell myself it was fine. I could still handle this. I could still control this. But then, a sound broke through the silence. A soft scrape. It came from behind me, just barely audible at first. Like a chair dragging on the floor, or something lighter, something smaller. I whirled around, my eyes searching every inch of the room. The walls were bare, the furniture undisturbed. There was no one here. But the sound, it kept coming. The soft, scratching sound grew louder, and my breath caught in my throat as I realized where it was coming from. The walls. The walls were moving. I took a step forward, my mind still trying to grasp the impossible. The scratching, scraping noise seemed to come from behind the walls, as though something was crawling just beneath the surface, trying to get out. My hand reached for the wall, trembling as I pressed my palm against the cold, smooth surface. I could feel the vibration, the movement. And then, a voice. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't even a word. It was a sound, guttural and low, like something ancient and terrible had just stirred. The air around me grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that I could see my breath in the dim light. A chill spread across my skin, creeping beneath my clothes. The scraping grew louder, more frantic, and the voice. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was laughing. A dry, cracking sound that seemed to echo in my mind, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. I took a step back, eyes wide, my body moving instinctively toward the door, but the moment I turned, I heard it again. The scraping was at my feet now, like something was crawling up from beneath the floorboards, something that was far too large, far too alive. I bolted for the door. The footsteps in my mind were louder now, echoing like the footsteps of someone or something chasing me. I could hear it. The soft tapping of feet against the floor, the click of nails on wood, getting closer. I grabbed the door handle, but before I could open it, a sudden slam of force hit the door from the other side, sending me stumbling back. My heart stopped in my chest, my mind reeling. What was happening? What was out there? The pressure against the door was unbearable, as if something was pushing on it from the other side, something heavy and menacing. I had to get out of here. But I couldn't move. The shadow in the hallway, it was there again. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I looked closer, I saw it wasn't. The figure stood there, still, unmoving. Its presence seemed to stretch the very air around it, warping the space in a way that felt wrong. It wasn't just standing, it was waiting. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The figure stepped forward, its movement smooth and unnatural. It didn't walk. It glided, the space around it warping, as if it was never truly part of the world. The closer it got, the heavier the air felt. The world around me seemed to grow dimmer, the shadows stretching, reaching for me. I turned to the door again, my hand shaking violently as I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck. And then, a voice again. But this time, it wasn't coming from behind the walls. It was coming from inside my head. You cannot escape. The words were clear, but they weren't mine. They weren't even a voice. It was the presence itself speaking to me, its cold, suffocating force squeezing the very breath from my lungs. I stepped back, and that's when I saw it. A small, cracked cabinet's door in the corner of the room. A place I hadn't noticed before. And behind it, nothing. It was empty. But the whispering, that persistent, terrifying whispering, it was louder. It was closer. It was here. And it would never leave. The weight of the presence behind me was suffocating, like a storm just waiting to break. My heart raced, my chest tightening as I stumbled backward, my eyes fixed on the cracked door in the corner. The whispering seemed to come from all directions now, swirling around me, echoing in the corners of my mind. It was a murmur, a low, guttural sound that felt as if it was seeping into the very fibers of my being. I could feel my breath shallow, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin, but the temperature in the room continued to drop. The air had become thick, almost solid, as if I were wading through it. My legs shook beneath me, and I barely managed to keep myself upright. It was as if the walls were closing in, pulling me closer to whatever that thing was. I couldn't look away from the cabinet. I didn't know why. Maybe it was because I had never noticed it before. Maybe it was because it was empty. But that wasn't the reason my eyes were glued to it. It was because I knew something was behind it. something I wasn't supposed to see. I backed away slowly, my hands gripping the doorframe as I tried to steady myself. I felt the air shift, and it was as if the very room was alive, watching me, judging me. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow longer, stretching toward me, as if they too had a mind of their own. The whispering grew louder, closer. It was like a chant now, an ancient language I couldn't understand. But I could feel its meaning deep in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. You cannot leave. It wasn't just a voice anymore. The entire room felt like it was alive. The walls, the floor, the very air, everything felt wrong. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out, but my body refused to obey. My legs were like lead, frozen in place, unwilling to take a single step. I took a shaky breath and turned toward the door again, the one I had tried to open earlier. It was still locked, the handle cold and unyielding. The figure in the hallway, it was still there. Watching. Waiting. Its presence had filled the entire space, and now I could feel it closing in. I had to get out. I had to do something. The whispering was louder now, a cacophony of voices, overlapping and mutating into something dark. I could feel the words reverberating in my head, like they were scratching their way into my skull. You are not alone. A chill raced down my spine, and I spun around to face the empty space behind me. But it wasn't empty anymore. There, standing in the corner, was a figure. The figure. It was no longer a shadow, it had taken form. A tall, dark shape, draped in tattered robes, its face hidden beneath a hood. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them on me. The figure stood motionless, its presence suffocating the air around it. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt tight, as if it had been constricted by invisible hands. The figure didn't move, but its presence seemed to stretch farther and farther until it consumed the entire room. I tried to back away, but my legs betrayed me. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the dark figure that was now staring straight at me. You are mine. The voice rang out in my head, not spoken but felt, deep in my bones. It was a promise, a terrible, ancient promise. And I knew that no matter how much I fought, there was nothing I could do. The room seemed to spin, and the shadows twisted and writhed. The walls began to breathe, expanding and contracting, as if the house itself was alive. The floors groaned beneath my feet, the sounds of scraping and shifting filling the air. I turned back to the cabinet, my hands trembling as I reached for it. My fingers brushed against the wood, and for a split second, I thought I felt something moving behind it. I couldn't take it anymore. I ripped the door open, desperate to see what was inside, what had been hidden from me. But when I looked, the cabinet was empty. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. But then, from the darkness of the room, I heard something new. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving closer. I turned around, but the figure was gone. It had vanished. But the footsteps, they were still there. I was no longer alone. I wasn't sure where the sound was coming from, but it was closing in, and fast. My body screamed at me to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. My mind was screaming, telling me to leave, to get out before it was too late. But I couldn't, because I was already too deep in. The whispering was back, louder than ever, the voices overlapping, growing frantic. They were inside my head now, filling every crevice of my mind. You belong to us now. The footsteps were closer, and I could feel them. I could feel them getting so close. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A shadow. A figure. I snapped my head to the side, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the dark. But the footsteps, they were right behind me. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and everything went black. I woke up with a jolt. My eyes snapped open, but the world around me was cloaked in darkness. I could barely breathe. My chest felt like a vice had tightened around it. Panic surged within me, and for a moment, I wondered if I was still trapped in that nightmare. My body felt heavy, like it was sinking into the ground, but I couldn't move. My muscles were frozen, paralyzed by the terror that clawed at the edges of my consciousness. Where was I? The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the faint smell of mildew and decay lingered in the stale atmosphere. The floor beneath me was cold, hard, and unfamiliar. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own labored breathing echoing in my ears. It was so silent, too silent. I tried to sit up, but my body resisted, as if some invisible force was holding me down. I couldn't move, couldn't even twitch a finger. And then, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized something. I wasn't alone. I could feel a presence, a suffocating, oppressive weight, like something was watching me. Not from a distance, but right next to me. I could almost hear it breathing, faint and shallow, but unmistakable. No. I was alone, I reminded myself. I had to be. The last thing I remembered was the dark figure, the footsteps, that chilling grip on my shoulder. I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing. But then the smell hit me, a smell so pungent and rotten that it made my stomach churn. The stench of decay and death. I gagged, and my body convulsed involuntarily. Slowly, hesitantly, I opened my eyes again. Nothing. There was no figure standing above me, no presence towering over me. But the air was still heavy. The weight was still there. It lingered like a shadow in the corners of the room, pulling at the edges of my sanity. I pushed myself up, this time with more force, my limbs shaking uncontrollably. My heart pounded in my chest, the beats deafening. But no matter how much I tried to steady myself, the tremors wouldn't stop. I was shaking, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. Something primal. The room around me was still too dark to make out any details, but I could feel the walls closing in. My fingers brushed against the rough, damp surface of the floor. Dirt. Old, dry dirt. A crawl space. I had somehow ended up in a crawl space. I had no idea how I got here or how long I had been unconscious. My mind was a jumble of fragmented memories, flashes of the figure, the footsteps, the suffocating presence that had clung to me. But it was all slipping away now, as though it had never happened at all. I forced myself to my feet, my legs still unsteady, like they didn't want to carry me. My heart raced as I shuffled forward, one slow step after another, my hands stretched out before me to find the walls. Then, a whisper. A voice. It wasn't the same whisper I had heard before. It was clearer, more distinct. It was almost like it was right behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the cold, empty air. Yet, the whisper had been unmistakable. A voice I couldn't understand, but I could feel it deep in my bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a command. an undeniable pull towards something dark. I moved forward again, faster now, desperate to escape the feeling that something was just behind me, waiting for me to slip up. Every step felt like it was leading me deeper into this hellish place, and yet I had no idea how to escape. The walls seemed to stretch on forever, and the air was becoming thicker, harder to breathe. Then I saw it. A light. Faint at first, but as I got closer, it grew stronger, flickering like a candle. It was the only thing in the darkness that seemed real, that seemed like it could guide me out of here. But as I reached out toward it, I felt a chill run down my spine. A sharp, biting cold that made the hairs on my neck stand up. It wasn't the cold of the crawl space. No, this was something different. Something alive. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I turned slowly toward the source of the light. There, standing in the center of the room, was a figure. It wasn't the same figure I had seen earlier. This one was different. It wasn't cloaked in darkness, it was lit from within, like a silhouette of light. The figure was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, but it wasn't a human shape. It didn't have a face, no eyes to meet mine, but I could feel it, feel its presence, feel its gaze. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was the same feeling I had when I first woke up. That oppressive weight. That suffocating presence. And then, without warning, the figure reached out. Its fingers were long, impossibly thin, stretching toward me. The air around me began to grow colder, freezing, like I was being consumed by a force that was not of this world. I tried to back away, but my legs failed me. I could only stare as it advanced. Its movement was unnatural, sliding forward, like it was gliding across the floor, its fingers never touching the ground. It wasn't just a figure. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something far worse. I closed my eyes, too terrified to look anymore, but the cold was unbearable. The darkness was closing in, suffocating me. And then I heard it. A whisper. You cannot escape. I couldn't breathe anymore. I couldn't think anymore. And then the light flickered out. And everything went dark. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.